Many photographers have very strong opinions on which metering mode gives you the best exposure. But when it comes to real estate photos, most get this completely wrong and it could waste a lot of time and also hurt your image quality. So what I'm going to do in this video is I want to cover what the different metering modes do to affect exposure, how to measure the proper exposure with metering modes for real estate photos, how you can simulate the metering modes while you're doing post-processing to double check your work and make final adjustments as well. And then I want to show how to avoid some of the biggest mistakes with metering modes that can affect your image quality. Let's start out in camera to set our exposure for this space. So first, we'll set the camera to manual mode. Next, we want to display two exposure tools, which we can see on the back screen here. The first one is the histogram, and that evaluates exposure for the entire frame. Now, you may need to cycle through the display or info button on the back of your camera. For instance, on this Z5, as I cycle through it, you'll see I get different types of displays, and then one of those will show then eventually my histogram. If you don't see your histogram during live view on the back of your camera, then there is an alternative I'll cover shortly as well. But the second tool is the exposure indicator, which is usually displayed all of the time if you are in manual mode on most cameras. Now, on different cameras, this is sometimes called an exposure value scale, a meter scale, exposure meter, or exposure indicator. So you can find that in your manual if you can't find then this throughout your menu system or it's not displayed on the back screen. We can see how both of these tools react when changing the camera's exposure, like adjusting the shutter speed. If I lower the shutter speed, then you can see that the histogram is moving to the right because the image is getting brighter and the exposure indicator is going up. Same thing as if I then tighten up on the shutter speed by going to a higher shutter speed, things get darker throughout the frame, the histogram then moves to the left, and then the exposure indicator goes down to the minus side. Next, we're going to change the camera's metering mode. But when we do, we'll see a big difference between the histogram and that exposure indicator, and that's because the histogram doesn't utilize metering modes, and instead, that uses the entire frame. So histograms use the entire frame, but the exposure indicator does utilize the metering mode. So we can use both of these tools to evaluate the frame's entire exposure and parts of it. So let's look at the various metering modes and how you can utilize them for real estate photography. But before getting to that, I just wanted to take a real quick break and mention that if you did want to learn more about real estate photography, I'd invite you to take a look at my courses. I've got online courses that teach professional interiors, expert editing, exterior photography, videography, business and marketing, and I've also written a series of books on real estate photography as well, and I have links to all of that down in the description of this video. Moving along now into our metering modes, this is using a Nikon Z5 that we're seeing through right now. And I can change the metering modes from the I menu that's on the back of the camera. By selecting that, I have this configurable menu, and one of those items you can see over here is metering. When I select that, then I've got the various metering modes that we can use. First, we'll take a look at matrix metering, and sometimes this is called evaluative metering, depending on the camera that you have. And what this does is when I select that metering mode for the matrix metering, that evaluates a large portion of the frame, not exactly the entire frame, but kind of close to it. And it closely resembles the exposure of the histogram, making it somewhat redundant. But this is an option you can use if you can't see the live histogram on the back of your camera, since this is evaluating a large portion of the screen, and it doesn't matter, for instance, where I'm moving my focal point. As you can see, I'm moving my focal point around here, and neither of these exposure indicators are changing. The histogram stays the same, and of course, that's because it's evaluating the entire frame, but also the exposure indicator on the right, that's not changing because it's evaluating a large portion of the frame, but most cameras do display a live histogram, so it's kind of an outside case of where you'd actually need to be using matrix metering mode for real estate photography. Once again, it just gets redundant. So let's move on to the next metering mode, and that one would be the center weighted metering. Now, what this does is it evaluates then the center portion of the frame. So once again, no matter where I really move my focal point to do any type of evaluation, it's not really going to change, but this isn't very accurate because it's once again just at the center of the frame. The next one, which is more useful, is if we go over to the spot metering. And this is useful, for instance, if we want to see what the exposure is at a certain point. So for instance, here I can see that the histogram is pretty much where I'd like it to be for exposing this particular frame. We can see though that because I'm over the windows here with my focal point, that the exposure indicator is pegged. If I move my focal point down, then you can see in a darker area here that's by that piano bench, you can see it's much lower. Same thing over here on the base of that telescope. So as I move this around, I can see what the exposure is at these various areas. So at this point, I'm measuring two things. My histogram is showing me the entirety of the frame and its exposure, and then my focal point is showing me then the exposure for where that focal point is on the exposure indicator. The next metering mode though is quite interesting. It really leads into other issues, and that's our highlighted weighted metering. And in here what it's doing is it's automatically going to adjust the exposure based on the highlights. But you can see here it's really not doing anything. It's really not changing much. But if we then change, for instance, from manual mode to aperture priority, I'll do that here on the camera, you can see things change dramatically. And that's because what it's doing is automatically adjusting the exposure to make sure that we retain our highlights. So it's not something we would use for real estate photography, but notice that when we did change into this aperture priority mode that we're in now on the camera, that the exposure indicator went away. That's because we're expecting the camera to automatically adjust the exposure for us. This also happens with any metering mode in aperture priority. For instance, let's switch back to spot metering. So I'll go back here to my menu and I'll select spot metering. So now that I've got this in aperture priority mode still, and we're using spot metering, if I move down here to darker areas, it automatically adjusts my exposure. If I move my focal point up to where it's bright, then it's going to adjust the exposure based off that. But once again, we're not seeing the exposure indicator, we're only seeing the histogram, and we're saying that we should then, by using this method of aperture priority mode and some type of metering, like in this case spot metering, we're saying adjust the exposure for this entire frame based on just where this one particular point is. But now let's turn it back to manual mode. So now we're back in manual mode, and we now have our exposure indicator back. And we can take control of adjusting our exposure by using both the histogram and the exposure indicator. So here, once again, I can change my shutter speed to match what I want to for this particular entire frame's exposure. And then I can see where the exposure is for certain areas by moving my focal point to certain areas and watching my exposure indicator. Here I can see that that's a very high exposure up against the wall, that's lower. Down here toward the floor, it's lower. And if I bring that focal point way up here to these high windows, we can see it's pegged. But so far, we've only talked about ambient shots. Let's now take a close look at flashed shots and then address metering mistakes as a whole. When using flash, it's a little bit different. Some of the rules still apply as far as how we want to expose to the right, like you can see here on the histogram in this finished image. Now, using this, I use the same techniques just like I showed before when we were looking through the camera to capture this particular image. But you'll notice here, some things are very dark down here and they're very bright up here. So it's very hard for me to just expose to the right and just use the histogram. This is where then using spot metering helped, and I'm going to show how to use spot metering to double check yourself in post-processing here shortly. But what I did when I was doing flash is I used enough flash power to where I can see that on the histogram that I'm exposing to the right. Now in this case, for the flash shot, it doesn't really do us any good on the camera to try to use a metering mode because we're not really automatically adjusting our exposure. We want this exposure to be consistent because, for instance here, and you've seen me do this many times before, I'm doing a two-sided composite here to edit myself out. And some photos take even more images than this when you're using flash. For instance, here's also a window pull to get that view to the outside. And then of course we have the finished image here. So it's a little bit different where when we're using flash, we're heavily relying on the histogram, not metering modes. But when we're judging our ambient shot, then just like we showed viewing through the camera, this can really help. using the histogram to judge the overall exposure, but more importantly, does that exposure need to be higher, like in this case, because we know we have darker areas. And that's where then using the spot metering mode, we can move the focal point here and see, well, that's really, really low, so we need to judge something based off of this and also these extremes. So it's probably good then to push our limit a little bit more. But once again, the metering mode here was used to check what we were doing. And that's what we can do once we're in Photoshop. So here, this is the Photoshop file that I was using to create this image. And by utilizing the histogram up here, then we can see the overall exposure, but I'm also going to show you how to do spot metering to check what you're doing in post-processing and also to demonstrate how this would have been checked in camera. So one of the things to do here on this histogram, a couple things, you do want to have the source as the entire image here. You also want to make sure that you're using luminosity is probably pretty good. You can use colors, but you want to make sure here that in this little hamburger menu, when you select that, you have an expanded view. Now that helps with the histogram, and you can then judge other areas. There's other things though you can do. For instance, we can go to all channels view, and then we see all the channels. So let's just leave it like this for right now, and then do some spot metering. So I should say spot metering checks. So what we're going to do is I'm going to use the marquee tool. It could be in the rectangular marquee, it could be the circular one. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a certain area and just see what the exposure is. So for instance, I'll go down here to these shadows down here underneath the island and just select a small area. You notice here that the histogram changed. So this would be similar to using then the exposure indicator on the back screen of the camera in spot metering mode. I'm measuring just a spot. I'll unselect that, I'll do Control D, and I can go over here to this brighter area, and the same thing applies. I'm able to check a spot in this one area. If I wanted to see more, I could keep selecting areas, and what I'm doing now is I'm kind of getting a matrix metering mode to see, well, in this area that I want to have the most attention to, is it exposing right? And if it is, well, what are the predominant colors? This takes it even further than what you can do just in camera. But let's also then take a look at what would have been in camera, taking a look at that ambient shot. So this was the ambient shot here, and you can see once again, yes, it is very bright, and you can see that a lot of that brightness is in the reds, a lot of the warm tones in this particular image. If I do some spot metering like I would have done in camera, I would have maybe brought my spot over here, my focal point by these cabinets, and shown that, ooh, that's really, really hot. But if then I take my spot down here and just measure underneath, I can see that it is way underexposed. So knowing these two extremes then, while I'm working with it, then that's how I knew that the histogram overall should probably be fairly high to the right. When though I'm editing my final image though, I get my exposure to the right, something I teach a lot in the Pro Interiors course and during the Expert Editing course as well, to get this type of image exposure. But this rule doesn't always apply. Notice here, this is mostly very light colors. While that's very common, we have other situations as well. Take these finished images, for instance. So this is a very dark billiard room, and it's not dark in that it's dimly lit, it's just because of the colors that are in it. Unlike that kitchen that was mostly white and had bright finishes to it, well, this has dark colors in its paint and its wood. So we can see that I'm not exposing to the right. Something here too that I wanted a little bit more mood. This was for a designer showing this bedroom in a 1930s house. And we can see that we want to have a little bit of mood, so I'm just at about the center of my exposure, not exposing to the right. And of course, when you're trying to do something with these very dark cabinets, that can be very difficult. And I have two peaks. One is because I'm very much here in the dark, that's most of the cabinetry, and then the rest of it you can see here is peaking over here on the right, but that's the smaller areas here. And of course, by using your spot metering, you can check that, and you can also do that in Photoshop. For instance here, taking this blue billiard room, we can see that it's not exposing even to center, and you can see what the dominant colors are. There's not as much red, reds are very dark, and of course then blues are about in the middle. If I though do a spot check here by using the marquee tool on the pool table down here, I can see that that is very high, and of course that's because the blues are just about blown out down there. So this is actually a very high exposure if I wanted to preserve the highlights while maintaining the rest of this image and not lose any of its information. This is also why I prefer to use flash, because then I can control where I see those very dark areas and where they need to have more light, but then also where it's very light and it doesn't need to have as much flash, or it could rely on ambient luminance during the flambient blending process. So along the way here, you've probably picked up on some of the biggest mistakes using metering modes. First and foremost, you want to be using manual mode. You don't want to have your camera automatically changing exposure for you. You want to be able to gauge what that is by utilizing your histogram, and then secondarily, you would be using your exposure indicator. Now, if you don't have your histogram, then once again, you can use strictly your exposure indicator and use matrix metering mode. But in most cases, using the histogram is what really saves you when it comes to exposure. Using then a spot metering mode gives you control of difficult situations to see where your exposure really lies. So as you're seeing the entirety of a frame with the histogram for its exposure, you can then judge individual portions of that image by using spot metering mode. And then when you're editing in Photoshop, remember that you can simply use the marquee tool or any other selection tool for that matter, and then judge on your histogram what that exposure for those specific areas are. So if you didn't have any selection, you would be seeing the entirety of it, of the histogram, so the entirety of the finished exposure. But if you're worried about certain areas, then you can spot check those by using a selection. Once again though, overall, photography is left up to interpretation. It's very subjective. There is not a standard rule that says you have to always expose this way. It's really up to you to make those decisions. Just utilize these tools to your advantage to help guide you on how you want your photos to look.